Hi, my name is Alana Gordon. I'm a producer on the Washington Post's audio team. As you may have already heard this week, right now you can become a Washington Post subscriber for just 99 cents every 4 weeks. And if you sign up by going to the link in our show notes or to washingtonpost.com/subscribe, it's a way to say that you value great journalism and the work that you enjoy listening to. If you've thought about subscribing, there's no better time. That deal will soon be over. Again, you can go to washingtonpost.com/subscribe or look for the link in our show notes. Thank you. And here's today's show.
I want to start by asking you guys if you are coffee drinkers.
I am.
I'm not.
You're not. I am wondering if you have ever considered the new Rudy Giuliani coffee that just came out this week. Have you guys heard about this?
It's so good you can drink it black. That's what he says. So good you can drink it black. I have not considered that.
And he describes his coffee as a way to support truth, justice, and American democracy, which you can make of that what you will. I'm curious if there were any politician's personal brand of coffee that you would drink. What do you think it would be?
You know, the problem with political coffee, I've had Black Rifle coffee, which is like another like kind of MAGA conservative brand, is they're always trying to be bold and tough, and you kind of just burn the beans. Like that's, you get like bad
Like, do you want your
beans.
coffee to be tough?
I don't want my coffee. I want it to be sweet.
Snowflake coffee,
Yeah,
some might say.
I guess so.
Welcome to the Campaign Moment on this Friday, May 24th. I'm Martine Powers, one of the hosts of Post Reports. And today, unfortunately, we are missing our colleague Aaron Blake, who is out sick. But that means that today I get to be here with two guests, Tyler Pager and Michael Scherer. Guys, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me back.
Thanks for having me on for the first time.
So Michael, as folks will know from last week, is a national political reporter for The Post, and Tyler is a White House reporter. And for folks listening at home, I think that they would be curious. Like, when you are a White House reporter, when you have your job, how much time are you actually spending at the White House or with President Biden?
It's a great question. So we have a 5-person White House team at the Post, and we sort of split it up week by week. And when it's our week, which this week happens to be my week, we go to the White House every single day. If there's a press briefing, we're in the chair in the press briefing room asking questions of the press secretary. If the president's traveling, we're traveling either on Air Force One or commercially to keep up with him. And so when it's my week, I'm there every day. And when it's not, it's more varied.
And what are the vibes like these days? Like with Biden's staff or just with Biden?
Yeah, I mean, it depends who you ask and in what mood they're in. Maybe the latest poll will dictate their mood. I think people are worried. The polls show consistently that the president is either trailing or locked in a very tight race with Donald Trump. And it's a real possibility, if not even more likely right now today as we're recording this podcast, that Trump is reelected in November. And I think that is overwhelming for a lot of people working in the White House and on the campaign, that they're reckoning with that reality.
So I want to talk about that in a few different ways today. And just to lay out what we're hoping to get to, we've seen reporting about a flag or flags hanging outside the homes of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito. Then there's inflammatory language coming from the Trump campaign. But before we get to that, I want to talk about a story that you, Tyler, did with our colleague Paul Kane earlier this week about how Biden's popularity in some key swing states is lagging behind other Democratic candidates. Tyler, talk a little bit about why you wanted to look at this and how you guys approach this reporting.
Yeah, so conventional wisdom usually is that most of the energy is focused on the top of the ticket. So in presidential election years, the presidential candidates. That is not really the case with Joe Biden this time around. We've seen over and over for years now that most Americans did not want Joe Biden to run again for president. They felt, for a variety of reasons, that someone else should be the Democratic nominee. And so we wanted to look at this effect of how Biden's candidacy will impact other races around the country, particularly in key states where Democrats are trying to maintain control of the Senate, which seems increasingly unlikely given the map, but also take control of the House, which in a funny way, is more likely that they take control of the House but then lose control of the Senate. We just wanted to take a scan of the country. How are those candidates that are locked in these tough reelection battles faring with Biden at the top of the ticket? And if you look at polls across the country, particularly in these battleground states where the presidential election will be decided,
that there is this big gap.
So in Wisconsin, a state Biden needs to win to be reelected. Tammy Baldwin, incumbent senator who has won multiple terms in the Senate, is running far ahead of the president and is more popular than him.
Which seems counter to how these things usually work, right? That like usually you have the president, especially if the president is popular, the president kind of buoys the Senate candidates in his party, and that is like not the case right now. That in some ways, like these Senate candidates the hope is might be booing Biden.
And I think it gets to what really makes this presidential campaign very different from past campaigns. I have not covered a campaign that so many voters do not want to be involved in or pay attention to or make a choice over. And I think these polls point to something that the Biden campaign is really focused on right now, which is that the people who will decide who wins the presidential race are not tuned in, don't want to be tuned in, do not like their choices at the top of the ticket. And I think that's the difference. In some of these states, you have high single-digit difference between how the Democratic Senate candidate's doing and how the president's doing. Those voters are not necessarily not Democratic voters. They're just voters who don't want to have to tell anybody they're choosing Biden right now. And the question of this election is whether those voters will come home as we get closer to the fall, and whether Democrats will succeed in their current quest, which is just to make this a binary choice, either A or B. You have to choose one. You can't not choose. And if Democrats succeed at that, they think they'll win.
One of the other interesting things that we found in our reporting, you mentioned our colleague Paul Kane, he spoke to a lot of House Democrats who are running in districts that they will win. They will win by maybe even double digits, but they say they're in overdrive because they want to energize even more voters to turn out for their races in the hope that that gets them to the ballot box to vote for Joe Biden. So there's this even other effect where Democratic candidates, Democratic representatives realize Biden is not popular. There are not a lot of people, particularly the key voting box, communities of color, younger voters, running to the ballot box eager to vote for Joe Biden. That energy and enthusiasm just doesn't exist. And it's really never existed for Joe Biden in a substantive way. But they're hoping that some of these other candidates who do have excitement, who are driving some popularity, will get more people to turn out for them, thereby helping Joe Biden as well.
And to get back to Michael's point, it's hard to imagine or hard to remember another presidential election where there was so much of a focus on down-ballot races or ballot questions, things like the abortion issue being hashed out in various states, that like these down-ballot questions become critical to this idea of like, are there enough reasons for people to show up at the polls to vote for president if they don't actually want to vote for president? Like, what are the other ways that you can sort of entice people to care about this election?
It's truly a remarkable moment in which they're trying to distract people from the main event. Like, the main event is the presidential election. We are deciding who's going to be the commander-in-chief for the next 4 years. But people just don't want to pay attention to that. They want, as Michael said, nothing to do with it. So it's like a basket of goodies of other things. Well, in Nevada or Arizona or Florida, you can vote to protect abortion rights, but also vote for the president of the United States as well. Or you can vote for this exciting, young, dynamic candidate in a House race, but also, oh, hey, you should also vote for Joe Biden or Donald Trump. It's just really a remarkable moment.
It's also scrambled the strategies that the campaigns are using, I think. Traditionally, if you have more money in the spring of a presidential year, you throw it on television because your opponent doesn't have the money to respond. You can help define the opponent however you want to define them. Biden's kind of been doing that. He spent $25 million, hasn't done anything for the polls. Like, there's just no evidence really that the polls are moving as a response to it.
Because it's like both of these people have been president already, right? Like, how much can an ad shape how people see Biden?
They're very well-defined candidates. And like I said, the people who are going to move the polls aren't paying attention. They don't want, they see the ad, they don't want to think about it. And so there's this debate now within Democratic circles about whether some of that money could be better used, like focus on the dog catcher candidate. Let's bring out even like there's a group called Run for Something that's been doing a lot of like hyper-local recruitment and Democratic races. And they've been arguing now that Democrats should spend less money on TV early, more money in these super local races, because maybe the bottom could push people into the
interesting.
marketplace.
Like the best way to spend money to help Joe Biden is not an ad that advertises Joe Biden, but instead an ad that advertises somebody else.
A city council candidate.
Makes you care about something that will get you to show up in November.
Or just investing in the resources of ensuring that there's a Democratic candidate running in every local race. I spoke to the chair of the North Carolina Democratic Party, and one of the things she was bragging about was that she has candidates running for all of these local races, state house races, other sorts of races that can get people out to the ballot box, that there's even someone to vote for, even if they don't win, boosting the turnout because they have someone to vote for. It's the same thing in Wisconsin. Some of the gerrymandering, the legislative districts have changed. Democrats there say that that's also helpful to the broader party building effort. But it's truly, as Michael said, scrambled the way that you think about traditional campaigning in a presidential cycle.
So let me ask this. Is the same thing happening for Trump? Is Trump dragging down some Republican, Senate candidates, for example? And is there the same sort of expectation that some of these candidates will help buoy Trump in November?
I would say it's a little more complicated on the Republican side. If Trump were generic MAGA Republican, like not Trump, just generic MAGA Republican, we've had a number of test cases since 2016, 2018, 2022 that show basically that candidate doesn't do very well, especially in these states. Lost in Arizona, lost in Pennsylvania, lost in, Wisconsin, Michigan, all these places, generic candidate doesn't do well. The thing that is unknown about Trump is whether he has the ability to reach out beyond normal voters, people who regularly vote because he's Trump, because he's a celebrity, because he monopolizes everyone's attention, and really drive up enthusiasm. There was a weird thing in the 2020 election where Trump lost the popular vote and the Republican House actually overperformed. People were sort of shocked by the number of seats Republicans in the House won. One argument for that is that he was able to bring out people in California, to vote in these districts that were, they were picking up seats in the House where it didn't matter in the Electoral College vote, but he was just able to bring voters in. So I think it's a very different equation on the Republican side. And it's much more a question of whether Trump himself can get people excited to vote. I mean, one of the real dynamics of this race right now, which I think people are still trying to get their heads around, is traditionally the higher the turnout, the better Democrats did, right? So midterm elections during the years of George W. Bush and Barack Obama, lower turnout elections, Republicans did better. Mm-hmm. That's totally flipped. Like midterm elections now, Democrats do better.
Interesting.
And that's because a lot of the voters who always vote, older people, college-educated people, suburban people, they flipped. They used to be Republicans.
And now they're more Democrats.
They're more Democrats. And so there's an argument being made right now that the higher turnout, the more people you get registered, the more people who turn out, overall will help Republicans now. And so it's everything's kind of gone
topsy-turvy.
Topsy-turvy, in the land of Trump.
All right, we're going to take a short break, and then we'll come back to talk about the latest fundraising emails from the Trump campaign and why they have raised some red alarms. We'll be right back. So while the Biden campaign is problem solving and trying to woo the voters that he needs to win key swing states, the Trump campaign used some extremely questionable language this week in its communications. Michael, can you explain what exactly it was that his campaign said?
The Trump campaign this week put out an email alerting its followers that President Biden had, federal agents locked and loaded and ready to use deadly force when they raided Mar-a-Lago, a pretty inflammatory claim that suggests the current president of the United States was willing to threaten the life of his Republican challenger, which is not true.
And it was basically accusing Biden of considering assassinating him.
And give me money. Click here for $5 donation.
Help me fight back.
Yes. And so I think for a lot of people, this felt completely out of left field. Where did this come from? This locked and loaded language? Why is Trump accusing Biden of considering having him killed?
So a couple of years ago, there was a raid on Mar-a-Lago because former President Trump was allegedly keeping classified documents improperly. The Justice Department had asked for the documents to be returned. They had not been returned, so the FBI authorizes a raid.
I think a lot of people remember this moment of the federal agents showing up outside his house and taking all these boxes of stuff out of his house.
Before the raid, there was paper exchanged internally in the FBI about what to do under various scenarios. And this is standard language the FBI uses. If the FBI is raiding your home and you threaten an FBI agent, the FBI is authorized to fight back and to use lethal force. And so these documents that were internal FBI documents that, again, use standard language for almost any FBI raid came out in a court proceeding that is going on in Florida this week. And the Trump campaign jumped on it as somehow an extraordinary threat to the former president of the United States, as opposed to this is what happens when federal agents come through the door.
And when, just to add on to that, when federal agents searched Joe Biden's house in Wilmington as part of their investigation to his handling of classified information, they similarly had the same sort of regulations about bringing firearms onto the president's property. Because as Michael said, it's standard practice. When FBI agents are executing a search of anything, they're always carrying weapons.
So now that we've made that clear that no one in this case was actively trying to kill Trump, why do you think the Trump campaign has latched onto this now? Like, why did they take out this document from the unsealed records coming out of this case and like pounce on that as an opportunity for how to get their supporters to think about this moment in the race?
I think one thing just important to understand about how Trump world operates is it's rarely, if ever, the Trump campaign that finds this. It's conservative activists, conservative influencers who seize on this stuff and spread it on social media. And then Trump, his allies, his aides pick up on it because it's just floating around in the ecosystem and the echo chambers of Trump supporters. So this is another example of activists reading through these documents and picking up things, taking them out of context, and then blowing it up. But I think this is part and parcel to Trump's entire argument for running for re-election. This idea of retribution, this idea that the deep state, as he and his supporters say, are out to not only get him, but all of the sorts of people that support Donald Trump. He's very much made his legal troubles, his challenges, a universal identity for anyone who feels singled out, disaffected, or not part of a group. And he's saying, they're not just coming for me, they're coming for all of us. And so I think this idea that FBI agents were, quote unquote, locked and loaded to potentially harm Trump, it's not just about Trump. He's trying to connect that broader idea that if they're doing this to me, they're going to do this to you, and we need to stick together.
And I think it's also important to connect this with the moment that we're at in the hush money trial in New York, right? Like, this trial is close to wrapping up. We expect jury deliberation next week, and a verdict is likely to come soon. And, you know, who knows what that verdict is going to be, but you can already see Trump kind of laying the groundwork for whatever this verdict is. This is not an objective criminal justice system making a determination about me. Like, this is all a political attack. This is coming directly from President Biden's DOJ. And like, they are out to get me. And maybe that involves like trying to kill me at my house with FBI agents. And maybe that involves this quote unquote fake trial that is just a kind of political attack on me, but that it's all kind of part of this way of making people want to be on his side, I guess.
And it's muddying the waters. I mean, there's so many different criminal trials. Obviously, this one in New York is a New York State trial. Biden and his Department of Justice have nothing to do with what's happening in New York. And obviously, the Department of Justice is the one prosecuting Trump in Florida and in D.C. for two different cases. And then there's the Atlanta case, which is also totally separate. But Trump...
To be fair, it's like clear to make this all muddy because it is very confusing.
It is very complicated. It's very easy for most Americans to not differentiate between these cases. And Trump, every time he links them together or blames Biden for them, it's understandable that most Americans would not exactly understand what he's referring to because it is inherently very complicated.
He also loves blaming his opponents on whatever they're attacking him for. And if you remember, there was that Supreme Court argument just a few weeks ago in which Trump's lawyers were arguing that the president of the United States could have legal authority to kill an opponent. It wasn't that he had tried to do this, but and Democrats...
It's part of the argument.
It was part of the argument. And the Supreme Court largely seems to reject that in oral arguments. Unlikely that's going to be the law of the land later this summer. But here's an instance where Trump can go to his supporters and say, look, the current president is already trying to come after me, even though it's not true. And to underscore what Tyler said, all this stuff is like the core idea, the pivot that he makes in his big rallies is they're not coming after me, they're coming after you, that I'm just standing in the way to defend you. So if federal agents can raid my house with the possibility of killing me, that just means they're one step away from raiding your house. And so it's really an argument for voters. It's an election year argument.
Michael, you bring up the Supreme Court, and I think this is a good place to turn to the reporting that started last week about a different kind of messaging. So the New York Times had a story that in 2021, at the home of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, in the weeks after January 6th, an American flag had been flying upside down on a flagpole in the yard. And as a lot of people recall, at the time, that was kind of considered a symbol for Stop the Steal supporters. And it was the sign that was seen at the insurrection. Alito, in a statement to the Times, said that this was because his wife had displayed the upside-down flag because she was upset about some other yard signs that some of her neighbors had. But I'm curious to get your reactions on this first piece of news. And, of course, then there's also been an update.
Well, I think the update defines this first piece of news because, he was making an argument here that this was just a neighborhood dispute, that his wife had gotten upset, not him. His wife had gotten upset.
Which I feel like I've seen a lot of jokes this week about the theme of politicians like blaming their wives for.
Bob Menendez in his trial is also blaming his wife for all of the
making unwise decisions.
Exactly.
And so he basically made his argument here that this was a localized dispute, that this was a spousal issue, that this has nothing to do with me, nothing to do with the Supreme Court. And then we find out, if I can reveal the next news.
Please go for it.
But Alito has a vacation house in New Jersey, and he was flying a different flag, the Appeal to Heaven flag, which is explicit.
Or someone in his household was flying that flag.
That's right. His house was flying an Appeal to Heaven flag. We are not aware of any neighborly disputes in New Jersey. And the Appeal to Heaven flag is explicitly like a revolutionary flag. I mean, it's a reference to a John Locke quote that basically says, like, when local laws no longer protect you and you're an oppressed people, then you can appeal to heaven and revolt and stage a revolution. It was used during the Revolutionary War.
And spotted at the Capitol on January 6th.
Spotted at the Capitol. It's basically a call for the right to step outside of a legal system when the legal system is not following God's will. And that's a pretty remarkable thing for a Supreme Court justice, the highest ranking person in our legal system, to have flying outside his home.
And just to be clear, at this point, we haven't seen any comment from Justice Alito on this second report of the second Appeal to Heaven flag. But Tyler, what do you like? Why is this so, eye-raising? Like, I think a lot of people would say galling.
I mean, I think there's many reasons. We're even seeing some Republicans say this wasn't a good idea from Alito, and we know how rare it is for Republicans to criticize conservative justices of the Supreme Court. I mean, there's a whole host of reasons. Chief among them is that the Supreme Court is currently debating a case in front of them about Trump and his ability to be charged in relation to the January 6th insurrection. And so the fact that it appears that Alito has even the impression of an opinion or a take on this event colors the ability for Americans to believe that he is unbiased in deciding how to apply the law to an event that he has ostensibly expressed an opinion of. And I think one of the things that was striking for me was a conversation I was having where someone said, imagine if a liberal justice had had a flag or a sign in their yard during 2020 in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, where it said Black Lives Matter. You could imagine what the reaction would be from conservatives if that was the case for any of the liberal justices. And I think this comes at a moment where we're seeing much more increased scrutiny on the Supreme Court and the actions of individual members. And I think there was a long time where there was this deference to Supreme Court justices that they were sort of off limits. And I think people are now learning a lot more about the Supreme Court and the justices and their political opinions and activities.
And the lack of ethical standards that are kind of written out in a more rigorous way, or a way of holding these justices accountable for instances in which you could argue that they violated the kind of ethical requirements of their job.
Right.
Chief Justice Roberts has tried really hard over the last decade to maintain the nation's respect for the Supreme Court. It still is higher than many institutions in America, which are, in the the low double digits. And I think one of the remarkable things here is that it's just fueling the fire of discontent among Democrats who are increasingly looking at legislation to expand the court. There is a legal path for Congress to say, we're going to add 3 more justices or 2 more justices, or we're going to add term limits to the court. It would radically transform how the court works. It's not written in the Constitution. It's doable. It's still a minority opinion within the Democratic Party. But if judges, are seen as political actors, not as judicial actors, not as non-biased actors, you can see a path for that just to grow over the coming years. The other thing I would say is Justice Alito stopped going to the State of the Union addresses after 2010. And
what happened in 2010?
So he'd gone a number of years. I think in 2010, Barack Obama was giving an address, had said something about a recent Supreme Court case, said it would insert foreign money into U.S. elections.
With all due deference to separation of powers, last week the Supreme Court reversed a century of law that I believe will open the floodgates for special interests, including foreign corporations, to spend without limit in our elections.
And the camera cut just as that was said to the Supreme Court justices, and you could see Alito's mouth say, not true. He wasn't shouting it. He wasn't protesting. He was just sort of talking to himself, but it was caught on camera. He got some backlash for that. And he said afterwards that he was upset that the camera had caught him. It turned out that it wasn't really true. I mean, it was an error at least it didn't directly lead to foreign money in U.S. elections. But after that, Alito said, it's too political an event. I'm constantly trying to figure out whether I stand up or sit down, or do I applaud?
Do I not clap?
Do I applaud the troops?
Clapping the audience, or clapping the office, or clapping the phrases that he's saying?
And so he ostensibly embraces that necessity. The law does not say Supreme Court justice can't have political opinions. The guidelines are that Supreme Court justices should not express those political opinions to protect the integrity of the court. And these flags are a real challenge to that.
All right. So with all this in mind, looking ahead to the next week, what are the both of you going to be paying attention to as this campaign continues to unfold? The hush money trial to me sticks out as if we get a verdict, what is that verdict and how is it going to affect Trump? And will people care?
Yeah, I think that's the big question always with Trump is what matters, what doesn't, and what is sort of the fallout of these major decisions. I think for Biden, one of the things that we're closely monitoring is the month of June. It's just a really packed month for him. He has 2 foreign trips, and the first of his son's criminal trials is slated to begin in June.
Hunter Biden's trial.
Biden's trial in Delaware about lying on a form. It is possible that trial gets highly personal, and prosecutors have signaled they may call Hunter's ex-wife, Kathleen, to the stand, as well as Beau's widow, Hallie, to the stand, who had a relationship with Hunter after Beau died. And it would just be quite the moment to see Hunter on trial and his ex-wife and Beau's widow testifying to help the prosecutors potentially convict Joe Biden's son.
And the timing of this, too, coming right after the Trump trial, where it's does the Biden campaign, I'm sure that there are elements in the campaign that if Trump is convicted, that they want to really capitalize on that, but to turn around and then have a member of your own family who is then standing trial. And obviously the circumstances are different, but as you say, just a very painful, complicated, awkward moment.
And don't forget the first presidential debate is next month as well.
Oh, yeah. Is that what you're looking forward to?
Coming on the 27th.
I got the impression last week that debates were not exactly the most thrilling prospect for you.
No, I'm excited about it. I think I'm excited for the legal moves of Robert Kennedy Jr., who seems likely to sue CNN over the tweet qualifications.
Though the poll on Wednesday didn't help him.
But he did get a poll on Thursday that puts him at 3 out of 4 that he needs to get on the CNN debate stage.
All right. Guys, thank you so much to both of you for being here. This was so lovely chatting.
Thanks for having us.
Go have a cup of coffee.
Michael Scherer is a national political reporter, and Tyler Pager is a White House reporter for The Post. And our usual compatriot, Aaron Blake, will hopefully be back soon. But in the meantime, you should definitely subscribe to his newsletter, The Campaign Moment. You can find the link for that in our show notes and at postreports.com. And also, if you are tuning in via Post Reports, make sure that you are following the Campaign Moment podcast itself. That's where we're going to be dropping extra episodes as the campaign season picks up. So be sure to look for that podcast wherever you listen. Today's episode was produced by Ted Muldoon, along with the newest member of our team, Laura Benshoff. It was mixed by Rennie Svernovsky. It was edited by Renita Jablonski and Mary Jo Murphy. Our team also includes Maggie Penman, Rena Flores, Lucy Perkins, Monica Campbell, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Sabby Robinson, Emma Talkoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresnan, Allison Michaels, and Alahe Izadi. I'm Martine Powers. Have a great Memorial Day. If you're a barbecue person, enjoy the barbecue and tell other people who are hanging with you about the campaign moment. Thanks so much. I'm honestly surprised that Michael agreed to be on the show again this week because of what happened as we were leaving work a couple days ago.
She tried to kill me last week.
Yeah, I came really close to, I almost ran him over with a car. Not really. I was coming out of the parking lot, and
that parking lot is a little dangerous.
She was in the alley. It was worse.
I mean, one could argue
we both saw each other.
biking.
We stopped. I just gave her a nasty look. And
one
she
is
felt
not
bad.
supposed to be biking on the sidewalk in downtown DC.
That is true, Michael.
I think I've seen you biking on that sidewalk before.